Gautam Adani is one of India's biggest tycoons, with interest in ports, telecoms, and renewable energy. He's perceived to be close to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and was the target of a short seller. Now, in another twist, he is facing US bribery charges. To be clear, Adani says the accusations are baseless and denies them. But scrutiny from US prosecutors is shining a light on India as well as Adani, who has amassed $31 billion of debt, making him one of the largest borrowers in the country. But what does this evolving situation mean to India, the world's largest banks, and the global economy more generally? This is all the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate about the biggest stories of the week with Breakingviews columnists. I'm your host, Amy Donlan.
And I am Jonathan Guilford. So, Amy, it kind of feels like we're in a golden era of industrial tycoons bestriding the globe, between Elon Musk and his entanglements with Donald Trump, Larry Fink kind of selling his wares across the planet. But, of course, Adani, the second richest man in India, the world's fifth largest economy, like even by those standards, he's quite a towering figure in his own country and abroad, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And with his fingers in many pies in India as well, very important to infrastructure. And we have been here before. We have had this conversation about Adani before for a different reason. We were talking to Shritama and Una before, our colleagues, which I'm going to now invite in to talk to us more about this situation. So we've got Shritama Bose, who is been covering this situation for Breakingviews, as well as Una Galani, who is the Asia editor for Breakingviews. So you are both very welcome. So, Una, I think the best thing of how we could start this conversation is to tell us what exactly is Adani being accused of by US prosecutors. I think these situations always strike fear when any US prosecutor comes calling. It sort of ratchets things up much more so than I think any other situation. So tell us, what exactly is the US accusing Adani of?
Sure. These are extraordinary allegations, to be clear. So the US Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission are accusing Gautam Adani, who is the chair of the Adani Group, and the Adani Group is a collection of 11 listed companies. They're accusing Gautam Adani and his nephew Sagar and a few others of agreeing to pay some $265 million in bribes to Indian government officials to win solar power contracts. And this case revolves around one of his companies, Adani Green Energy. And it covers events that took place between 2020 and 2024, allegedly took place, of course. And the US is effectively claiming jurisdiction here because the Adani Group sold bonds to US-based investors.
Wow, fascinating stuff. So, I mean, tell us again, maybe then, why this Adani scandal is such a problem for India more locally.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to overstate the potential sweeping political and economic implications of this situation. I mean, it's political because, as you rightly said, Adani is seen as close to the prime minister, and his empire grew so rapidly over the past decade, which Modi has been in power. And the shares of his companies rocketed. You know, some of them were trading on 300 times multiples of earnings. I mean, it's really, really extraordinary. This was just a couple of years ago. Now the opposition, of course, they smell blood. And Indian politics are very fractious. They're asking difficult questions. They've ramped up their calls for an investigation into the tycoon. And essentially, Modi's opponents are accusing the prime minister implicitly of crony capitalism. And this is a charge that has brought down governments in the past in India, or at least helped vote them out of power. Now, this is an extreme outcome. We're not there yet. But this is partly what is at the back of people's minds. And this is an economic problem for India too, because, you know, as you laid out, he's involved in so many parts of the economy. I mean, it feels like so much of India's rising star really rests on Adani's fortunes. He's one of three families through which all of India's business interests, or at least the bulk of it, is really consolidated. Their investments, they really drive GDP. He's the leader of India's energy transition. I mean, So many Indians will be sitting here today as asking this question. If Adani isn't building it, who is? And the thing is that India had a bad debt crisis about 10 years ago, and it took years to work through that problem. And the result today is there are not as many tycoons as there once were in India that have the risk appetite and ambition to build out things in the scale that Adani is doing today. So nobody wants bribery, nobody wants corruption in any economy, but ultimately, people also want to see things built and get done. So that's where we are.
Right. And right. And Shridharma, maybe that's the moment to pull you in, because obviously you've been talking to your sources about the likely consequences here for the Adani Group, for this web of companies. What are they saying to you? Is it possible that, even though Adani obviously denies any wrongdoing, and as Una says, there are some pretty vast consequences here if things start to go wrong, is it possible that banks will be spooked and pull back on lending to him? Can he just rely on Indian lenders? Are there international concerns here?
Yes. So, Jonathan, what I've been hearing is that there's quite a marked difference in the way global institutions that have partnered with Adani or lent to him are reacting to this and the way Indian institutions are. So, when you talk to global banks, obviously, or anybody out there that has a stake in Adani and is working elsewhere in the world, they will tell you that these charges are pretty serious, and the least we have to do at this stage is stop making any fresh investments or doing any fresh business with this group, right? But the Indian reaction is quite different, and that stems partially from the fact that Adani is a rare tycoon who has tremendous risk appetite and is building all these massive infrastructure assets. But also his assets are seen to be pretty good quality. They're ring-fenced, they are secured, they have strong cash flows. He's not known to default. So that makes banks, in India at least, quite comfortable with this group. And while they're not thinking about taking any additional exposure, now is not the time to do that. They are certainly not thinking about pulling the rug from under him. So they're quite comfortable at this stage. Of course, they are waiting and watching to see how far this goes. When the dust settles, I think they'll be back to support him.
Right. And that raises an interesting question, right? Which is how well equipped his financial empire, like all of these companies, are to withstand any scrutiny that comes in. Like you say, if it maintains some baseline level of support from Indian lenders, that's a pretty big fillip. But beyond that, how strong are these units financially? Can they handle a pullback elsewhere, slightly rougher weather, essentially?
Right. So the latest numbers that they've put out for the entire conglomerate, you see that they have enough cash to support repayments worth up to 28 months, more than 2 years. So effectively, they don't need to approach anybody for funding in the next 2 years, at least in theory. And so that's one level of comfort for anyone who's lent money to those assets. But at the same time, Indian banks, if they are called on to do so or feel compelled to support him any further, they do have room to do that. So the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, has a certain specific limit for group exposure for banks. So any bank can lend only up to 25% at the most of its total eligible capital to any one connected group of parties, which is one conglomerate essentially. So right now, Indian banks have about $13 billion of exposure to them. And the calculation that we did, if they max out their limits, it goes up to 5 times that. So they're nowhere near the limit right now. So, he can be sure of their support if he needs it.
I mean, it's effectively a lot of the thing to remember here is a lot of Indian lenders, not all of them, but a lot of them are state controlled, right? So the state can lean on them to lend, even if they don't necessarily think this is a good risk or a bad risk. And as Shridharma says, it's not in their self-interest to pull the rug out from under Adani. Not only is he a big borrower and is he a big depositor in the banks, knocking down this group would send enormous shockwaves across the economy. It would have profound implications. So, in the long term, the idea of pulling back to Indian banks and Indian lending to fund Indian debt to fund Indian infrastructure is a very sensible solution for the economy. But trying to do that under pressure, it's a pivot that, watching this group trying to do that, that's going to be very difficult.
And if you want to fund infrastructure and you're not funding Adani, who will you fund?
Yeah.
I suppose as well, though, so I think if I'm understanding you right, Shritima, basically between the cash that he has, in basically savings, the Indian banks that could hopefully help him, that he would certainly be able to weather this storm to a certain point. But I often wonder if you say, as you say, Una, if it's the government is sort of encouraging the banks to help with a situation where the US is leaning on a tycoon like this, does that create like bigger problems between the US and India? That
I don't think so necessarily. I mean, I think that, a lot of people in India want to see this, reducing this situation to sort of bad geopolitics. And some people are saying, Washington doesn't want India to succeed, and this is confirmation of that. And so we must be more self-sufficient. But in reality, the way some of the US agencies work, it's part, I'm sure like there's an element of politics to it, but it can also that, they can go after friend and foe alike. And so it's the line between those two things are not necessarily a straight one.
I gotcha. And Una, if I could go back, because we have all sat here talking about Adani before, the short selling sort of attack on him early last year. What is the reaction like versus, well, first of all, I suppose, again, maybe just remind our listeners what exactly happened with Hindenburg and what they accused Adani's empire of being. And also then what is the sort of difference, I suppose the add-on question to that is, what is the difference between now and that attack?
I think, so this is like the Hindenburg short attack on steroids. So 2 years ago, Hindenburg, a US-based short seller, came out and they published a long report and they said, accused Adani of committing fraud, a giant fraud across its companies on multiple levels. And obviously the Adani group denied it. And the stocks went on a huge roller coaster ride, lost $150 billion of value, recovered most of the way until we got to where we are today, in which now they've taken another knock back. Now, the difference this time, of course, is that the reaction, so it gives us a clue of how the crisis will play out. But the reactions this time are going to be sharper. Rating agencies are already changing their outlooks to negative. And global banks will probably have less discretion to assess the loans on their financial merits. So as Shritima said, a lot of the loans of like great quality, he doesn't default, ring-fenced, secured by cash. But ultimately now you have a US agency making some serious allegations rather than just a short seller who you can his report you can throw in the bin and just carry on, business as usual. So I think that the reputational risks that stakeholders have to consider now are much more serious. And so we're seeing this play out in other countries now as well. So in Sri Lanka, people are sort of questioning like the projects there. In Bangladesh, they're questioning the projects there with Adani. So I think people are just going to take what is not the same accusation, but a similar vein of crisis, and they're going to interpret that in a much more serious way.
I would add to that the reaction of global institutions in this case could be a bit different from the last time round, because at the end of the day, a short seller has their own financial motives. They're making a bet, essentially. But US Feds are a whole different story. So they would be a lot more cautious this time around, is my guess.
Right. So what is likely to happen next? It seems like you say the most important next stage is kind of sorting out the international links and who will continue dealing with Adani and who won't. You've already had sort of statements from the likes of Total Energy saying, oh, we didn't know that there was an investigation. We won't be making new financial contributions to Adani until the charges are clarified. You have this web of banks that has to figure out their kind of links. Like, ultimately, like, how do we proceed through this at this point, like outside of the actual legal workings of the case itself?
So look, I think about what next in a couple of ways, right? So who will and won't deal with Adani? So I think definitely Indian banks will probably continue to deal with Adani. I also think Asian banks might continue to deal with Adani because they may have a different risk appetite. The Japanese are big lenders, the Middle Eastern banks are big lenders. And I also think that it's possible some of their partners in emerging and developing parts of the world where they've been making Belt and Road types of investments in the long term may be less worried about these types of allegations against a group like Adani that is sort of investing alongside the Indian government. A lot will really depend in the long term about how much Adani's fortunes rise or fall with any change of government when the next government after Modi comes into power. In terms of like what's immediately next, we know that the Adani Group is due to meet a lot of US investors in early December. And that is when they'll probably get a really good read on the US investors' concerns, and by then they'll have a better sense of like what the financing constraints and parameters for them are going to be. And, you know, I don't know really like that. I don't necessarily see that banks will pull back loans quickly, but they may refuse new things like hedging contracts. They could in an extreme situation, try to recall loans early, but they may just like let it burn out in a kind of slow manner. So, you know, I think that early December, mid-December is when we're really going to get a better sense of what's happening. And of course, some people are hoping that a change of government will be helpful, right, in the US.
Yeah. I think that I was going to add that everyone's hoping that happens. Lots of people here certainly do. And I think in terms of what's next for the Adani Group, apart from sorting out who does business with them and who doesn't, it's probably a given that parts of their business will have to slow down expansion. So, you know, their core infrastructure businesses, the ports and the road building and airports and, you know, the massive renewable energy park they're building in India, which is supposed to be 5 times the size of Paris, none of that will probably stop because many of those projects have their funding tied up. But there are some other parts of their business, for example, the materials with cement, mining, things like that, they may have to slow down growth in those segments where they just started to expand. They'd been making a lot of bolt-on acquisitions in the cement sector. You know, they bought 2 of the largest companies from Holcim and they borrowed for that. That kind of inorganic growth is probably off the table for some time now.
Yeah, so Shrutima is exactly right. Like, effectively, the group needs to decide now what to protect, right? So they have a certain amount of cash flow they're throwing off, and they'll have a certain amount of financing which they can rely on. But like, do they decide, okay, like we are the infrastructure group of India, we're going to protect our core infrastructure assets, and we're going to keep investing in those, but we're going to pull the brakes on other kind of less core parts of the empire?
It's such a fascinating situation. Just like, obviously, this really colourful, well-known tycoon, the US claiming jurisdiction in this situation, how reliant India is on this individual for just the growth and just the vitality of the economy. And everyone, I guess, in some ways, hoping it just goes away is what I would imagine. So I look forward to reading so much more of your stuff. The next point, I assume, is December. But thank you so much, Shrutima and Una. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Jonathan.